Some say miracles only happen to people. But on a storm-lashed coast, a wild stallion named Saltwind was cornered by wolves atop a sea cliff. Waves crashing below, nowhere left to run. What he did next would defy nature, silence his hunters, and rewrite the laws of survival. From prey to legend, Saltwind didn't just leap across the rocks. He leapt into something no horse had ever passed before: hope. The wind came in sideways, cold and salted, dragging the breath out of the Oregon coast and tossing it inland like forgotten whispers. Gray clouds hung low over the cliffs of Haven Reach, a small coastal region far removed from the hum of highways or the glow of towns. Here, with a Pacific carved jagged stone into monuments of defiance, the beach was more battlefield than sanctuary, especially on mornings like this. Saltwind moved with regal ease across the wet sand, his hooves sinking slightly with each step. His coat, the color of driftwood washed in storm, shimmered faintly in the broken morning light. Saltwind was not young. He was in his prime, perhaps 9 or 10, but he bore himself like something out of a lost myth. His mane whipped behind him, a silver-black banner in the wind, and his pale eyes scanned the shoreline with a kind of alert calm. He led his herd with a quiet, almost eerie wisdom. 5 mares of various shades and temperaments followed his lead, always 2 lengths behind, always trusting. A single foal, barely 3 months old, tottered between them, its legs long and uncertain, its fur still fluffy from youth. Saltwind never strayed too far from the rear of the group, glancing back often. This was not just watchfulness, it was memory. Once, years ago, a foal had been taken by a cougar while he chased shadows in the dunes. He'd never forgiven himself. Far above them, perched at the edge of a wind-blasted cliff known ominously as Dead Mare's Leap, stood a woman with a pair of binoculars and an aching past. Maren Doyle was 38, tall and willow-thin, with a crown of tangled auburn hair bound into a messy braid that tugged loose in the breeze. Her face bore the weathering of grief, not wrinkles, but softness worn away at the edges. Her brown eyes, once expressive and quick to smile, had dulled over the years into something more contemplative, almost glassy. 5 years ago, she had lost her partner in a kayaking accident in these very waters. He had gone out before sunrise, chasing sea lions for photography, and never returned. Since then, Maren had drifted to the edge of the world like flotsam. She lived alone in a single-room cabin a half-mile from the cliffs, survived on freelance ecology reports, and found quiet meaning in studying the wild herds of coastal mustangs that had called Haven Reach home for generations. Her binoculars were focused now, not on the waves or the gulls, but on Saltwind. She'd been tracking this particular stallion for nearly 2 years, documenting his behavioral patterns for a research paper that, frankly, no one had asked for. But Saltwind was different. He didn't just react, he chose. She had seen him refuse a watering hole if the wind carried odd scents. He'd rerouted the herd's grazing route after a landslide weeks before the trail had visibly shifted. There was something uncanny in his leadership, something human. As she scribbled a note in her leather-bound journal, movement caught her attention along the dunes near the base of the cliff. At first, it was only a shimmer, like light bending where it shouldn't. Then she saw the unmistakable flick of a tail, the crouch of muscle beneath mottled fur. Wolves. 7 of them. The Blacktide Pack, as locals called them, had long haunted the caves and hollowed ridges around Haven Reach. They were coastal predators, slightly leaner than their inland cousins, their coats dark and sleek like wet stone. Their eyes, striking yellow, gleamed even in the gray light, full of intent. They were not scavengers. They were hunters, deliberate and intelligent. Leading them was the alpha male, a broad-shouldered brute with a crescent-shaped scar across his snout and one ear notched clean through. Locals had named him Reaver. Maren had only seen him once before, from afar, chasing a wild goat along the basalt terraces. But there was no mistaking his presence, commanding and cruel. The wolves moved like liquid shadow, fanning out across the rocks in near silence. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a formation, a strategy. Maren's heart picked up speed. Her binoculars swung back to Saltwind. He hadn't seen them yet. The wind was working against him, blowing the wolves' scent out to sea. She reached instinctively for her old radio transmitter, then stopped. Who would she call? The nearest ranger station was 2 hours away and underfunded. They barely responded to human emergencies, let alone Mustang ambushes. Her fingers trembled, not from cold. The air felt electric now, thick with tension. The clouds were closing, darker than before, and the wind gusted harder, driving sand like needles against exposed skin. Maren adjusted her position on the cliff's edge, boots scraping at loose stone. From here, she could see it all. Saltwind finally lifted his head. The stallion froze, ears erect, nostrils flared, and then he moved, not in panic but precision. He circled his herd swiftly, herding them inland with subtle shifts of his head and chest. The Mares responded immediately, flanking the foal and increasing speed toward the dunes. But Saltwind himself did not follow. He stood, legs planted, directly in the wolves' emerging path. Maren could see the challenge in his posture. She could feel it. Reaver saw it too. He halted the pack. For a breath, neither leader moved. Only the crash of waves below and the screech of gulls filled the silence. Then Reaver advanced. Maren's breath caught. The hunt had begun. Saltwind stood his ground, the wind coiling around him like a whip of salt and sand. The Blacktide wolves fanned out below the dunes, their movements slow and deliberate, as if rehearsed. From her perch above, Maren Doyle adjusted her focus. Her heart thudded against her ribs, not just from fear for the horse, but because something about the wolves' formation unsettled her. They weren't chasing, they were steering. Reaver, the scarred alpha, moved like a general among soldiers. He didn't rush. He stalked. And as he pivoted his head to survey the terrain, Maren suddenly understood. They weren't after the herd. They were after Saltwind himself. He was being isolated. The stallion turned his head briefly toward his Mares. They were moving inland, the foal clumsily kicking sand, flanked by 2 experienced Mares, Whisper and Rook. Saltwind had trained his herd well, but now he was alone, cut off, exactly as the wolves intended. Down the beach, the shoreline curved inward before jutting violently into a sharp, narrow promontory. Breakers Fong, a thin strip of jagged basalt that split the ocean into twin torrents. Saltwind was being forced toward it with each measured advance from the wolves. Maren's breath came fast and shallow. She scanned her surroundings for anything that could shift the unfolding pattern. That's when she saw it. A flash of movement in the Titapool flats below. Small, round, and struggling. A pup. No, a seal pup. It was stranded between rocks, maybe 2 or 3 weeks old. Pale gray fur plastered against its sides, eyes blinking in confusion. It must have been swept ashore during the early tide and gotten caught when the water retreated. Maren cursed softly. She had 2 choices: continue watching the wolves and Saltwind, or intervene for the seal. She chose both, scrambling down a narrow, twisting path along the bluff's edge. She clutched her binoculars in one hand and a canvas bag in the other. Pebbles slid under her boots as she descended. The wind stung her face and grit filled her teeth. But when she reached the lower flats, the seal pup was still there, shivering, wedged between 2 stones, its breathing fast and shallow. Maren dropped to her knees. Up close, the creature looked even smaller. Its whiskers trembled with each breath, and its flippers scraped helplessly against the basalt. A shallow scrape along its side wept thin trails of blood. "Hey there, little guy," Maren murmured. "You picked the wrong morning to get lost." She took off her outer jacket and carefully wrapped the pup, lifting it gently. It didn't resist, only blinked, trusting her with blind faith. She tucked it in her bag, leaving the top open for air, and turned back toward the trail. As she climbed, the canvas shifted slightly against her ribs, and she heard a tiny sneeze. She smiled despite herself. "Pebble," she whispered. "That's your name now. Pebble." Back atop the cliff, Maren crouched low, the seal pup bundled beside her beneath a spare tarp. Her binoculars found Saltwind again. He had reached Breaker's Fong. The narrow strip of rock jutted into the sea like a dagger. Wet and treacherous, it was no place for a horse, but Saltwind stood at its base, nostrils flaring, hooves scraping in protest. The wolves had pressed him precisely where they wanted. One wrong step would send him tumbling into the ocean below, where the surf churned violently against the cliffs. Reaver moved in, his pack tightening like a vice. One wolf darted forward, too fast, too bold, and Saltwind struck. A flash of hoof, a sharp yelp, and the wolf rolled back, limping, its flanks scored. But the rest were undeterred, and now the tide had started to rise. Waves clawed higher against the base of Breaker's Fong, and wet mist curled over the rocks. The basalt slickened, and Saltwind's rear hooves slipped an inch, then two. He righted himself with a powerful jerk, nostrils wide, eyes wild but focused. Maren felt her chest tighten. This wasn't just about survival. It was about anticipation. Saltwind wasn't retreating. He was thinking. The wolves advanced again. 3 from behind, 2 from either side. The last, the injured one, held back, panting. Reaver made no sound. He didn't need to. Suddenly, Saltwind turned sideways, not to bolt but to shift his weight. He backed along the narrow ledge of Breaker's Fong, his body tense but balanced, hooves skimming the wet stone. And then, just as one wolf lunged, he pivoted sharply and leapt. Not into the sea, but across a narrow gap between 2 cliffs, a chasm barely wider than his body. His muscles coiled and sprang, propelling him through salt-laden air. Time slowed. The wolves halted mid-charge. Even Maren stopped breathing. Saltwind soared. Below, the ocean screamed against the rocks. Spray erupted upward like shattered glass. His hooves cleared the gap by inches. He landed hard, stumbling slightly, but regained balance in 2 steps. Safe. The wolves stared in disbelief, their prey suddenly unreachable. The leap hadn't just saved him, it had disrupted their entire strategy. And Saltwind, chest heaving, turned, not in fear but defiance. Maren exhaled, her whole body trembling. Her binoculars slid from her hand as she pulled Pebble closer. The seal pup nestled against her, warm and pulsing with fragile life. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she heard the ghost of her partner's voice, the one who had loved storms, who had always believed nature rewarded the brave. She didn't cry, not yet, but something inside her shifted, as if the tide was turning in her too. Saltwind walked along the far ridge now, calmly, not fleeing but relocating. He would circle back, she knew, rejoin his herd once the danger passed. Maren watched until he disappeared beyond the dunes. Then she stood, adjusted the seal pup in her arms, and began the hike back to her cabin. There would be warmth, fish broth, and dry towels waiting. And, for the first time in years, something else too. A reason. The air cracked like a whip as Saltwind disappeared into the mist, his silver-gray body swallowed by the sea spray below the cliffs. The impact of his hooves leaving the rocky ledge echoed into the sky, a defiant punctuation against the crescendo of crashing waves. Time seemed to splinter in two, before the leap and after. On the upper bluff, Maren froze. Her breath caught mid-throat, eyes wide, binoculars trembling in her grip. Pebble, the seal pup, squirmed lightly in the makeshift pouch at her side, sensing the tension that choked the salt-thick air. For a moment, nothing moved. Not the gulls overhead, not the wolves. Even the wind, ever-present and relentless, seemed to halt in reverence. Saltwind was gone. The wolves clustered near the ledge, their yellow eyes scanning the mist below. Reaver, the alpha, paced the edge with a restrained frustration. His massive shoulders rose and fell with each slow breath. He hadn't anticipated this. No predator did. Prey ran, stumbled, fell. They didn't leap. Not like that. From her vantage point, Maren watched the pack fracture. 2 younger wolves, a sandy-coated female and a lean black male, glanced at Reaver for instruction, but the scarred leader only stared into the void. He didn't snarl. He didn't command. He was calculating. She could feel it even from a distance. This wasn't over. Maren stepped back from the cliff. A sharp edge bit into the heel of her boot, but she kept steady. She couldn't let the image of Saltwind's fall root her in despair. She hadn't seen a body. Not yet. And that meant something. A wild hope stirred in her, a trait she hadn't let herself feel in years. She turned toward the trail that led back to her cabin, Pebble swaying gently with her stride. The pup had quieted, either asleep or simply trusting. Maren looked down at him. He was breathing steadily, lips puckered in a half-dream, whiskers twitching. "I don't know if he made it," she whispered, voice barely audible over the wind. "But if he did, I'll find him." Back on the beach, hidden from view behind the jagged cliff face, Saltwind's world was a blur of noise and pain. His body had slammed into the ocean like a stone, but with instinct alone, he had twisted midair just enough to lessen the impact. The water embraced him with punishing force, dragging him under. Cold surged into his lungs. He kicked. Above him, light fractured into ripples. Bubbles swirled. His hooves scraped against something, rock barnacle depth. He surged upward. Saltwind burst through the surface, gasping, nostrils flaring wide. Water poured from his mane and back as he spun in the current, disoriented but alive. The sea was not a field he knew. It moved with chaos. Every wave threatened to pull him sideways or down. But his legs, strong from years navigating dunes and valleys, kicked with rhythm. He aimed for a narrow shelf of rock where gulls nested, barely visible through the spray. Each wave shoved him off course. But slowly, inch by inch, he closed the distance. On a bluff half a mile inland, an old shepherd dog stirred from his nap. Dusty was a mutt of questionable origin, part collie, part something heavier, with a coat like sun-bleached wheat and eyes milked by age. He lived alone in the barn of the last standing homestead on the outskirts of Havenreach, a tilted structure belonging to the man who had once cared for him, Tom Reyes. Tom was no longer around. He'd passed the winter before last, a quiet death in a chair facing the sea. Since then, Dusty had kept the barn as his own, surviving off scraps left by the occasional ranger and the kindness of Maren, who came by once a week to refill the water trough and leave behind dry kibble. Today, though, Dusty stood on aching legs. Something was wrong. His ears, though dulled by time, caught the distant sounds of wolves. His nose, battered but functional, twitched into the wind. Salt, fear, blood. He hobbled out of the barn, limping along the dirt trail that led toward the cliffs. His hips creaked, and his breath came shallow, but Dusty had served as a guard dog in his youth, and some instincts never left. At the edge of the outcrop near the tide-slicked rocks, Saltwind dragged himself onto the wet stone shelf, legs trembling beneath him. His body ached, flanks bruised, but no bones were broken. Salt clung to his lashes, stung his eyes. He snorted hard, clearing his lungs. Above him, gulls scattered at his approach, screeching into the wind. He stood slowly. Behind him, waves still crashed in violent applause. Ahead, a path wound through a rock arch, narrow and hidden, but climbable. He moved forward, step by step, muscles burning. Back at her cabin, Maren lit the fire. She placed Pebble in a shallow wooden basin padded with blankets and checked the pup's wound. It was shallow but tender. She applied a salve from her emergency kit and covered the gash gently. Pebble chirped softly, eyes closing. A knock on the door startled her. No one ever knocked. Not here. She opened it to find Ranger Maren Hayes, a lean woman in her early 40s with freckles dusted across her sun-browned cheeks and a habit of dressing in 3 layers regardless of season. Maren was sharp, ex-military, soft-spoken, and dependable. She'd helped Maren once, years ago, when Maren had refused to leave the water's edge during a storm warning. Got reports of howling near the ridge, Maren said without preamble. Black tide, likely. I figured you'd be out in it. Maren nodded. I was. I saw something. Saltwind. He jumped. Over the fawn. I don't know if he... Maren raised a hand, calm but direct. You think he's alive? I don't know. But I didn't see him fall. Not all the way. Maren looked past her shoulder, eyes falling on the seal pup bundled in the basin. You've been busy. He was stranded. I couldn't leave him. No one said you should. They shared a silence. Then Maren offered a half-smile. Let me radio the lookout. See if anyone's got eyes on him. These horses, they don't die easy. Saltwind's hooves dragged against the rocky shelf as he pulled himself fully out of the tide's reach. Each breath he drew sounded ragged, his nostrils flaring as he fought to fill his lungs with air, not sea. He stood on trembling legs, seawater sluicing down his flanks. Behind him, the crashing surf continued its relentless rhythm, a haunting reminder of what he had just escaped. His mane clung to his neck in heavy strands, tangled with seaweed and salt. Yet in his eyes, still sharp with resolve, there was no fear, only the quiet knowledge that he had endured. The shelf he had landed on connected to a thin trail, a nearly forgotten footpath overgrown with scrub and wild heather. It twisted up the cliffside, narrow and uneven, invisible from the upper bluffs. Saltwind's instinct guided him forward, limping, slow but steady. The air was colder here, less windswept, partially shielded by the crags. The distant calls of gulls echoed overhead, but no wolf sounds followed. He was alone. For now. Miles away, back on the main ridge, Maren stood still, her eyes focused on the beach far below. She had left Maren at the cabin, promising to radio back if anything changed. But waiting had never suited her, and after the ranger left, Maren grabbed her pack and returned to the place she last saw Saltwind vanish. She kept low along the dune's edge, her boots sinking into soft sand and shell, the sea breeze now heavier with moisture than movement. The sky remained a sheet of pewter, and though the wind had died somewhat, the air still smelled of thunder. Pebble lay snug against her chest in a lined sling. The little seal had grown more alert with each passing hour. When she spoke to him now, gentle murmurs of reassurance, he responded with soft clicks and chirps, his head lifting, nose sniffing the air. His wound had begun to scab over, and he blinked at her with trusting black eyes. Maren scanned the sand near the base of the cliff. For a long moment, nothing. Then her heart skipped. A track, a single hoof print, deep and fresh, etched into a patch of wet sand not yet dried by the wind. She crouched beside it, brushing away loose grit. It was unmistakable, Saltwind's print. She had studied them for 2 years. His stride was long, with a slight outward flare to the front right. This was him. She straightened slowly, her fingers still tingling. Hope flared sharp and hot her chest. He had made it. With renewed energy, she followed the trail, each step guided more by instinct than logic. The tracks were sporadic, often lost to wind or rocky ground, but they always returned, faint smudges in dried mud, a broken patch of seagrass, a shallow divot where a hoof had tested stone. She pressed forward. A mile inland, beneath the rusting ruins of an old signal station, Saltwind rested. The skeletal frame of the building, once a naval watch point, offered a thin shield from the wind. Saltwind had collapsed beside a rusted-out metal drum, his legs folded beneath him. He was not asleep, but in a state of alert rest, ears twitching, eyes half-lidded, muscles coiled beneath his battered hide. The signal station had long been abandoned. Its last caretaker, decades earlier, was a man named Hollis Grant, a veteran with a crooked gait and too many stories. He had painted murals inside the station's walls, using scraps of marine paint left by coast patrols. Now those images, seals, whales, wild horses, faded under layers of time and graffiti. But one wall remained almost untouched, a painting of a stallion rearing against a wave. It stared now across the open doorway at Saltwind, like a ghost of the wild itself, watching over him. Maren reached the station near dusk. The trail had narrowed into stone and brush, difficult for her and nearly impossible for wolves. She found Saltwind by the quiet of his breathing, the rhythmic rise and fall hidden behind a slope of earth. She stopped, heart pounding. Pebble stirred in her sling, then fell silent as if sensing something sacred. Saltwind raised his head. They stared at one another, woman and stallion, neither making a sound. Maren slowly slid the sling from her shoulder and knelt. She didn't speak, didn't reach, just remained still, offering presents without demand. Saltwind watched her, eyes flicking between her and the seal pup, his breath measured. He did not move. Minutes passed. Then Saltwind shifted. He stood, limped forward a few steps, not toward her, but away from the ruin, from the shelter, toward the path that would lead him back to his herd. Maren exhaled. A single tear escaped down her wind-burnt cheek, not for sadness, but for the strange fullness in her chest. Pebble nuzzled into her coat. As she prepared to follow the trail back to her cabin, she paused at the edge of the old signal station and looked once more at the mural inside. The painted horse seemed to shimmer slightly in the last light of dusk, as though some part of it had just breathed for the first time in years. The evening light poured over the dunes like soft gold spilled from a broken sky. The wind had calmed, though the air still carried a bite, brisk, salty, and restless, like the breath of something ancient waking after sleep. From the shadow of the ridge, Saltwind moved slowly, one step at a time, his legs sore but stable, each hoof press against the ground careful and intentional. The wounds from his ordeal were shallow, but the weariness ran deep. He had come full circle. Below, spread across a cove, dotted with dune grass and driftwood, his herd grazed cautiously. The mares, Whisper, Rook, and the others had clustered near a shallow hollow sheltered from the wind. The foal, restless and unaware of the full weight of recent events, pawed at a tangle of sea kelp, snorting at it with playful defiance. Saltwind watched them for a long moment from behind a veil of scrub. His breath slowed. His ears twitched at familiar sounds. No wolves. No threats. Only home. Whisper was the first to notice him. She lifted her head, ears pricked, her neck stretching toward the wind. A low nicker escaped her throat, an inquisitive call. Rook followed, then the others. In a heartbeat, they were moving toward him, not in a charge, but a gentle tide of movement, like sand being drawn to its source. They met in the half-shadow of the setting sun. Saltwind remained still as each mare approached in turn, touching noses to his flanks, his shoulders, his face. It was a silent ritual, part greeting, part confirmation. He was here. He was alive. The foal came last, bounding forward before being gently corralled by Whisper. Saltwind dipped his head and pressed his muzzle lightly against the foal's neck. The moment lingered in stillness. From the crest of the opposite ridge, Maren stood watching. Her silhouette was etched against the fading sky. Pebble nestled snug in a sling across her torso. The seal pup had become calmer, his coat soft and clean now, glistening under the fabric like a polished stone. He blinked slowly, head resting on Maren's chest, lulled by her steady heartbeat and the distant rhythms of the wild. Maren's heart thudded as she watched the reunion unfold below. She said nothing, made no movement. It wasn't hers to interrupt. But within her, something long frozen began to thaw. The wall she had built in the silence of her grief, walls of stone and solitude, shifted, cracked. What she saw below wasn't just an animal's return to its herd. It was something older, something essential. Connection. She crouched low, fingers tangled in the grass, and allowed herself to breathe deeply for the first time in months. The salt air no longer stung, it soothed. Unbeknownst to her, another set of eyes observed from further inland. Reaver, the old wolf, had not given up so easily. After the failed ambush and Saltwind's impossible leap, the Blacktide Pack had scattered. Two limped back into the caves, another retreated inland. But Reaver had circled wide, silent and unseen. From his position atop a rise of sea rocks, he watched the reunion with an expression unreadable to most. But Reaver was not like most. He was ancient for a wolf, at least 10 winters old, with a coat now streaked in gray, and wisdom etched into every muscle twitch. He did not growl. He did not charge. Instead, he watched as Saltwind rejoined his herd, and a quiet understanding passed through him. This game, this pursuit, had changed. He turned, slowly, and padded away, vanishing into the dunes like smoke. Back in the cove, the herd began to move again, Saltwind at the front once more. He led them toward higher ground, away from the sea, to the safety of grassy hollows and windswept ridges. The pace was slow, but certain. As they moved, Maren stood and followed from a distance, keeping to the shadows. She wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. An hour later, at the edge of the inland marshes, Saltwind paused near a familiar tree, a gnarled pine twisted by salt and time. He let out a long, low call, and to Maren's surprise, it was answered, not by a horse, but a low, gravelly bark. Dusty had found them. The old shepherd dog limped into view, tail wagging like a tired metronome. His coat was damp, matted with burrs and sand, but his eyes glowed with purpose. He had followed the scent, the sound, and some instinct too old for explanation. Maren stepped back behind a boulder and watched as Dusty approached the herd without hesitation. Rook, ever cautious, snorted in warning, but Saltwind remained still. Dusty circled once, then laid down at the base of the pine, his chest rising and falling in contentment. He had found what he was meant to guard, even if no one asked him to. Maren didn't approach. She didn't need to. She turned and made her way back toward the coast, Pebble now asleep, his tiny flippers twitching in dreams. Behind her, the herd settled under the stars, and an old dog kept watch. That night, as Maren lit the lantern in her cabin, she didn't feel alone. The sea was calm that morning, unusually so. The wind, which once tore through Haven Reach like a god in mourning, now whispered through the beach grass with the hush of a lullaby. The sky, stretched wide and clear, reflected the color of bleached denim, and the waves rolled in slow, steady breaths. A year had passed since the leap. Saltwind stood atop a sea cliff overlooking the crescent-shaped cove below, his coat shining like storm-slick stone under the sun. His frame had thickened with age and strength, but his eyes remained sharp, watchful, deliberate. Beside him stood Rook, now heavily pregnant, her ribs rounding with the promise of new life. The foal, once stumbling and unsure, had grown into a lanky yearling, its coat dappled silver and cream, always hovering near Saltwind's flank, mimicking his steps with coltish pride. Beneath them, the herd grazed among twisted driftwood and seaweed beds, careful even in peace. Saltwind had taught them well. Paths that once led to ambushes were now avoided. Watering holes were approached only from high vantage points. Saltwind's memory was not just survival. It was strategy passed on, embodied by every movement of his herd. And people had noticed. Across the rocky bluff, a group of researchers huddled behind a blind of netting and dune grass, cameras poised, notebooks open. At the center was Dr. Eliza Trent, a woman in her early 50s with silver streak curls pulled into a tight bun beneath a khaki field cap. She was compact and sharp-eyed, with a voice like gravel and honey, a tone shaped by decades in the field, and a mind that rarely entertained the impossible, until she'd heard of Saltwind. Eliza had once been known for her skepticism. In her early years as a wildlife behavioralist, she had made a name dismantling romanticized myths about animal cognition. But when footage surfaced of a stallion leaping a cliff, escaping wolves, and returning with his herd weeks later along a safer migratory route, even she had been forced to reevaluate. Now, with a team of grad students and a grant from the West Coast Wildlife Foundation, she had spent the past 3 months documenting Saltwind's movements. What she found had changed her. The stallion didn't just lead, he taught. Younger members of the herd watched his routes and replicated them. They waited at ridges, mapped the wind, read the scent trails of predators. This was culture. This was transmission. Maren had helped fund the study. She didn't do it for fame. She didn't even attend the weekly camp briefings. But she offered her cabin for supply drops, her field maps for navigation, and her handwritten notes, meticulous, annotated journals she had kept long before the scientists ever arrived. And now, as autumn settled in with its crisp mornings and migrating clouds, Maren sat in her cabin's window seat, a steaming mug of cinnamon coffee in her hands, and watched the legend she once nearly lost. Beside her on the rug lay Pebble, no longer a pup, but a healthy adolescent seal nearing full maturity. His coat had darkened to a soft slate gray, and his eyes, though still round and luminous, now held curiosity rather than dependency. He spent most days in the cove, but returned each evening, wriggling through a handmade flap Maren had cut into the door, his slick body leaving damp trails across the floorboards. They had settled into a rhythm, a companionship not born of need, but of mutual healing. The manuscript sat on the table, half-finished, scribbled through with notes and crossed-out titles: Saltwind, The Wild Mind, Across the Fong, The Horse That Calculated. Maren had yet to settle on a name, but the story had poured out of her, not just Saltwind's survival, but what it had done to her. How witnessing one act of pure instinct and courage had shattered the silence she'd wrapped around herself since Aaron's death. She hadn't published anything in nearly a decade. Now her fingers couldn't stop moving. That afternoon, Dr. Trent arrived at the cabin, knocking with the flat of her palm and waiting precisely 3 seconds. Never impatient, always structured. Maren opened the door, wearing a flannel shirt, hair wind-tangled, glasses slipping down her nose. "Eliza," she said simply. "Eliza now, is it? I feel promoted." Maren smirked. "You've earned it." Trent stepped inside, nodding at Pebble, who responded with a half-chirp and returned to napping. "We recorded something today," Eliza began, sliding a small device from her bag. She pressed play. The audio was faint, wind, birds, the rustle of hooves. Then a low call, not a whinny, but a sustained, deliberate vocalization. Another followed, then a third, from a younger horse. A pause. A fourth call, different pitch, shorter duration. "They're communicating," Eliza said. "Not just warning, coordinating. There's a pattern." Maren leaned in, heart skipping. "We may be watching the emergence of something we once believed exclusive to higher mammals," Eliza added. "Behavior learned, taught, passed on. We're not looking at instinct anymore, Maren. We're looking at evolution." Outside, the sun dipped toward the horizon. Saltwind moved once more to the sea cliffs, silhouetted in the golden light. A gust of wind blew inland, carrying the scent of salt and pine. Pebble stirred and lifted his head. Maren closed the recorder and turned toward the window. "It started with a wave," she said softly, "a leap, and a heart that refused to surrender. Sometimes the greatest leaps we take aren't physical. They're the quiet moments when we choose to rise again, to lead with love, or to protect those who depend on us, even when the world feels uncertain. Like Saltwind, we all face cliffs in life, moments when fear tells us to stop. But courage whispers, jump anyway." If this story reminded you of the strength we carry within, share it with someone who needs that reminder too. Leave a comment below and type amen if you believe that hope, loyalty, and resilience can still guide us through the hardest storms. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that touch the heart, and may God bless you and your family with peace, healing, and the courage to leap when it matters most.